The dance of the summits reached one of its periodic climaxes with the conclusion of what is not quite an EU treaty. With the Czechs and the British left as wallflowers, the rest of Europe waltzed into an agreement to be, well, much more German in matters financial. The outcome in relation to a key matter seemed to please one happy summiteer. The treaty agreed last night does not seem to require that its provisions be inserted into our constitution, even though its signatories make clear that they would prefer we do just that. Article 3 states that the balanced budget rules shall take effect in the national law of contracting parties through provisions of binding force and permanent character, preferably constitutional, or otherwise guaranteed to be fully respected and adhered to throughout the national budgetary process.
Basically, as long as it's permanent and guaranteed to be respected, that suffices. So in other words, the balanced budget requirement can be implemented by legislative means.
But for members of the opposition, this was the government denying the people their say in a treaty that could condemn the nation to decades of austerity and patronising them to boot.
Taoiseach, can I ask you finally, do you agree with your Transport Minister Varadkar that the Irish people are essentially so stupid they wouldn't be able to see what a referendum on the austerity treaty is about? That it wouldn't be democratic, do you agree with that, which he said? To have a referendum because people might have on their minds what he says extraneous issues.
We can justify anything by saying because democracy calls for it. The difficulty about that sort of argument is, as the scholars who've studied democracy for many thousands of years point out, there's no agreed definition on what democracy is or isn't. In many cultures it would say, well, the democratic argument is to find out what most people want. In other words, a majority, and that's what we do. That's democracy. And it sounds quite good. Now, when that existed in the north of Ireland, everybody said it wasn't democratic, but it was majority rule. Now with the referendum, we're going for what the majority wants.
And there is one thing that appears to move the hands of that majority in the ballot box particularly effectively. There does seem to be something of a pattern in our attitude to European referenda. The issue of sovereignty has been central to all of them, but when there have been large transfers of cash from Europe to us, that has tended to assuage somewhat concerns over the potential loss of control over our own destiny. During more recent referenda, when cash transfers have been far less generous, it does seem that worries over pooling of sovereignty have suddenly resurrected themselves. And one key figure has made clear that any referendum on this treaty would be very much about money, as in what variety of it we would have in our pockets.
If constitutional change is required, we will have a referendum and we will put the case to the people. And it will come down to, whether one wants to continue in the euro or not.
The European Union was always framed in this country as something that will give us money. That's why we went in. That's what we were told with the Single European Act and Maastricht. It was all about channeling funds to us. And indeed, it did channel funds to us, by and large. But it's also the case, I think, that even with funds coming in, the support each time in every successive referendum went down.
So the treaty does not require us to have a referendum, but could its provisions be found to be repugnant to the Constitution and end up before the people anyway?
There's actually very little in this particular fiscal treaty that's new. That's the interesting thing about it. There are a couple of provisions there that might be argued to raise constitutional questions. The so-called automatic debt brake that is supposed to kick into action under Article 3.2 of the fiscal treaty if fiscal limits are exceeded, well, that might be argued to intervene or interfere with Oireachtas powers in relation to budgetary matters. There's also a commitment in a later part of the treaty to a single economic policy. But on the other hand, we've already agreed in the existing treaty provisions, all Eurozone states, to ever closer coordination of economic policies. So whether there's a sufficiently large difference between the two of those to give rise to constitutional difficulties is doubtful.
For the leaders of the European family, this was yet another success story in the drive for further integration. Once more, they seem unaware that they are dragging many of their children kicking and screaming to this happy occasion.